All right, friends, welcome back to our online Bible study in the book of Ephesians. You've heard the phrase, when in Rome, which implicit in that is, when in Rome, go ahead and do what the Romans do. If you could sum up what's going on in this passage that we're reading today, which is a very controversial passage, by the way, it might be something like, when in Rome, go ahead and don't do what the Romans do. Remember, what we're doing here in the book of Ephesians, the second half of it, is Paul is helping us to work out what it looks like to live as if all this Jesus stuff is true. In chapter 1 through 3, he talks about the ramifications of what it means that Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, what that means. And then we get real practical. All right, how do we actually live in light of that? Here, he gets real practical and talks about how all of this gets worked out in some of our most intimate relationships. Husband and wife, parent-child, and a context that we don't have today but they had then, slave and slave owner. The fact that he is talking about slaves and slave owners is not him in any way condoning that there are slaves and slave owners. It's that there were slaves and slave owners. He had slaves and slave owners in the churches. So him acknowledging that relationship exists isn't him condoning that relationship. It's just that he's got real slaves and real slave owners that he needs to speak to. In fact, in other places, he condemns that even is a relationship. People get squeamish that he even talks about slavery. But if he wants to minister to people in Ephesus, that's what's happening there. So how do we make sense of this? You got to remember here, this is not a letter that was written to 21st century Americans. It wasn't written to us. Now, it's for us. It's authoritative for us, and there's truth that we've got to glean from it. But if Paul was writing a letter to 21st century Americans, he would use different examples. And he would talk about it in different ways. So what was true about the context he was writing this to? I've used these examples in Cornerstones. They may be repetitive for some of you, but they're super important. And I picked these three, even when I preached a while ago in Cornerstone, with these passages here in mind. Nero's street party. What was Nero's street party? Nero would periodically throw a party that had a purpose. The purpose was to allow men to experience what it was like to be him for one night. On that one evening, there were special laws. One of those laws was that women could not refuse, no woman could refuse any man for any reason. Just imagine what that was like for that evening. That was just Roman culture. Men in monogamous marriages were not expected to be faithful to their wives. Women were expected to be faithful to their husbands, but there were no expectations put on husbands. So there's that. There's the exposure that we've talked about in Cornerstone, that is when a child was born, the father would inspect the child. If he wanted to keep the child, he would raise the child up. That's where we get the idea of raising a child. If he didn't, he would give the child over to the exposure. And part of the inspection of the child would be to inspect the gender of the child. What is the exposure? It was just children being left to die. I mean, it's unbelievable to us, but this is just what happened. And it was just ordinary that not only was slavery allowed, but they believed that it was a part of the natural order, that this was just the natural order of things. So that's the worldview, that's the mentality of the people who are running things when Paul writes this letter. So Paul is essentially saying in this section, here's the deal, friends. When in Rome, which you're in, don't just do what the Romans do. When in Rome, we're going to live still in light of the revelation that we have of who Jesus is, which will cause us to do marriage, parenting, and if you find yourself to be a slave or a slave owner, you're going to do those relationships differently in light of your relationship with Christ. With all of that in mind, how does that change the way that you read these passages? And make sure you start with verse 21. With verse 21, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So who's being asked to submit? Everybody. With that famous passage, the next one about wives submitting to their husbands. Yes, He's saying wives should put their husbands above themselves. But what did he just say before that? All people are to submit to each other. He's just reiterating what he's already said. And then when he talks about husbands, he doesn't use the language of submission, but he uses the language of love, which for us sounds like weaker language, but for them would have sounded like stronger language. It's agape. It's the highest form of love. It's the kind of love where you lay your life down for somebody. Men, don't just submit to your wives. Don't just put them above you, but lay your life down for them. I mean, it would have been scandalous that Paul is not only giving instructions for wives on how to treat their husbands, but that he is telling husbands how to treat their wives. It would have been scandalous because he is implying, maybe even saying directly, women have rights. Crazy. In first century Rome. The idea that that fathers and mothers have responsibilities to their children, crazy. Because the idea it implies that children have rights. Same thing with the slavery thing. Now, we find out in another of Paul's letters, Philemon, that Paul doesn't like that people in the church are owning other people. Now, to dig more into the idea of slavery, and you got to understand, first century slavery in Rome is very different from what we think of. I dealt with this in long form, 30 minutes or so, in February of 2020, right before the pandemic hit, in Cornerstone. The title of the sermon was just Ephesians 6, 5 through 9, because I don't know what else you title a sermon about that stuff. If you want to dig more into that, you can dig more into that. Paul doesn't like the idea that people in church are even slave owners, but at the time they are. So he's saying to them, look, here's the deal. Says to one of them, at least specifically, you shouldn't be doing this. But he says to all of them, in the rest of the world, your dynamic is slave owner, slave. But look, in the church, the dynamic is very different. In the church, you all got the same God, and that God has no partiality. In the church, y'all are not slave owner and slave. No. In the church, you're brothers. And how do you treat your brother? Your brother and sister. How do you treat your sister? Your sister and sister. How do you treat your sister? See, he is turning the order completely upside down. So we read this and we're scandalized by it. But the reason we're scandalized by it is because we think that he is saying that to 21st century Americans. He's not. He's saying that to first century folks living in Rome. And we miss that it is revolutionary. It is radical. So the question for us today is, as we seek to live out what it looks like to be followers of Jesus today, the question for us is, who is it that we are putting ourselves above? He says, submit to one another. Who is it that you are expecting to submit to you? And what Paul is calling us towards, because of our belief in Jesus, is towards a life where even the people that the rest of the world says, that person should submit to you. No. I'm going to put that person above myself. Who you having a hard time putting above you? That's the driving question here. When in Rome, don't act like the Romans. God bless you, friends. See you next time.